I would like to introduce Ken Burns, who will introduce our presentation for today. Thank you.
So once again, I'm serving as a facilitator, replacing Pushpa, who I hope will be back by next week. Our speaker today is Dr. Steve Childers, who I met first as a faculty member here at UF some years ago, but most of his career, his professional career was spent at Wake Forest. He's a longtime researcher in the neuropharmacology of drugs of abuse, including opioids, cannabinoids, and cocaine. He received his BS in chemistry from the University of Texas and his PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin. He did his postdoc work at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine in the lab of Dr. Solomon Snyder, who at the time had just discovered opioid receptors, one of the fundamental breakthroughs in drug abuse research. Actually, Sal won the Lasker Award for that discovery. His first faculty position was in the Department of Pharmacology at UF. After 10 years, he moved to the Department of Physiology, Pharmacology at Wake Forest School of Medicine, where he helped found their National Institute of Drug Abuse Center for Drug Abuse Research and served as its director for 25 years. He retired as Professor Emeritus in 2016 and currently serves as Chief Research Officer of Inceptio Therapeutics, a small startup company that works to develop novel medications for cocaine abuse. Steve, welcome back.
Thank you, Ken. It's a pleasure to join you guys this morning. I have a lot of really good memories of being at the College of Medicine of Florida. I was happy to get the call from my former chairman, Al Nimes, inviting me to do that. We spent about an hour catching up with all kinds of stuff, and I had a lot of really good colleagues in the Department of Pharmacology. I'm sure they're all gone by now. But at any rate, it is a pleasure to be here. I am glad. I'm glad not to be in Gainesville in August. I do remember that, and I suspect it hasn't gotten much better since I left. But anyway, here we are. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here and see if that works. Okay, all right. So Al told me that you guys have a series going on alternative medicine, and certainly cannabis and cannabis-related products would certainly fall in that category. What I'm going to be doing today is really talking about the science involved in cannabis, including CBD and synthetic cannabinoids. I'll talk a lot about medical marijuana, which is a very important topic for me and others. Whenever I talk about cannabinoids, I like to always have a disclaimer. I don't have an agenda. I'm not going to be talking about drug policy and legalization issues. I'm here to talk about the science and educate people about what we know about cannabis and cannabinoid systems in the brain, and allow people to make up their own minds about how it proceeds. Obviously, I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. I guess since we're doing Zoom, we might want to hold those until the end, but whichever way it works is fine with me. All right. So, of course, when we think about cannabis, we think about the plant, Cannabis sativa, an ancient plant used by humans for many thousands of years. I think the original archaeology evidence of the use of cannabis goes back to Eastern China some thousands of years ago, maybe something like 3000 BC. We have to remember that cannabis sativa is not just used to get people high, but it is the hemp plant. Okay, so the hemp plant has been used in human society to make rope, to make linen, to make clothes, to make all kinds of different products for all of these thousands of years. The first real evidence of the psychoactive use of cannabis really comes from India, some many hundreds of years ago. The use of cannabis as a psychoactive agent was spread to the Western world by the Arabs in the Middle Ages, and the history goes on from there. When I talk to medical students about cannabis and marijuana, I like to talk, like to give a little bit of chemistry. I'm not going to talk chemistry here this morning, but remember that the cannabis plant is composed of a whole variety of different compounds we call cannabinoids. They're generally related to these kinds of structures. There are over 100 of these things in the typical cannabis plant, and the one compound that is really important for psychoactivity is this one, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. This compound is responsible for virtually all of the psychoactive effects that we associate with marijuana. There are many other cannabinoids. Cannabinol, for example, has very slight psychoactive activity, but really, when we talk about getting high and all the other effects that we associate with brain effects of marijuana and cannabis, it's really THC that we're talking about. And of course, you know, we have the compound we know very well today, CBD cannabidiol. It's closely related to THC in terms of its structure, but it really has zero psychoactive effects. It doesn't bind to traditional CB1 cannabinoid receptors, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So it has very different kinds of effects, and I'll talk more about that later. When I talk, like I say, when I talk to medical students about cannabis, one thing I say is that marijuana today, or cannabis today, is not your father's cannabis. When we think about marijuana in the 1960s, when it became more popular than it ever had been before, most cannabis plants range between 1% and 4 to 5% THC as a constituent. But over the years, as you can see, that has dramatically increased. We see now routinely 18, 19, sometimes over 20% THC in cannabis plants. And that's really associated with a variety of factors. We know the genetics of cannabis sativa quite well now. Cannabis growers are very good at selecting different plant types that produce high quantities of THC. They're also very good at providing the exact growing conditions that maximize the percent of THC in the cannabis plant. So the marijuana that's sold today has a much higher concentration of THC. Therefore, in a traditional smoked, marijuana cigarette, the dose of THC that people are getting are far higher than what people experienced back in the 60s and 70s, and that has some real significant consequences, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. There's something that I forgot to point out when I was talking about these molecules. Like I say, I'm not going to talk about chemistry today, but all of the cannabinoids, these compounds that are present in various concentrations in the cannabis plant, are all in the same general chemical category, and they are very lipophilic. And what I mean by that is that these compounds are virtually water insoluble, okay? They will not dissolve in any kind of water, saline, or aqueous solutions. They're highly soluble in fats and oils, and this is the way in which they are delivered in many cases. And in fact, that quality of being dissolved in fat has some real important consequences in terms of the way these drugs work, which I'll talk about in just a second. Once again, emphasizing the fact that these plants are a lot different from the ones that perhaps many of you, many of us have seen before. Here's just some of the some of the weird kinds of plants that you can see. To me, just amazing how much THC is out there and present in these things. Now, all of these plants, of course, are sold as cannabis plants, as sources of THC. Of course, the other side of this issue is cannabidiol, CBD. Once again, just like there are many different types of ways to grow cannabis plants in terms of increasing the amount of THC, cannabis growers can also go in the other direction, and they can create plants which have virtually no THC and high quantities of CBD, and that's what you're seeing in the CBD market today is product that's produced not from these kinds of varieties of cannabis sativa, but other varieties in which CBD dominates and THC is minimal. So there's all kinds of plant growing strategies that one can do for this kind of situation. All right, so let's talk a little bit about cannabis pharmacology and how cannabis gets into the body, how it distributes, and what we see in terms of its effects. So pharmacokinetics, that basically means, how does it get into the body? How's it distributed? And as I just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, this effect of THC is dominated by the fact that it is virtually insoluble in water. It's extremely soluble in oils and fats. Hashish is an oil, for example. That's the reason for that. Because it is so fat soluble, it has a very rapid intake into the brain. It crosses the blood-brain barrier very easily, particularly when it's smoked. So you get an almost immediate high effect, when you smoke THC, and that is primarily due to the fact, not only the fact that it's binding to these receptors that I'll talk about in a minute, but also because as it's so lipophilic, it just crosses that blood-brain barrier very, very easily. The other issue is that it has a very slow elimination in the body. So when you take THC, whether you smoke it or whether you have an edible, it is rapidly taken up not only by the brain, but also by other fatty tissues throughout the body, once again, because it's so fat soluble. So it sits around in fatty tissue, and it's very slowly removed from that fatty tissue into the bloodstream. And what that does is it really lengthens the elimination of THC through the bloodstream and through the kidneys. And so what that means is that you can detect THC for a very long time after someone has administered it. If you go to the literature, unlike alcohol, where you can look up the half-life of elimination of alcohol, it's very simple. There is no simple half-life for the elimination of THC because it really depends on the individual. Frankly, the more obese someone is, the more fatty tissue they have, the more THC is going to be soaked up in that fatty tissue and then slowly removed from the fatty tissue over time. So there are clearly half-lives of THC over 60 hours and probably more. And clearly that has legal implications in terms of, people getting, blood tested or urine tested for THC should for a long time. Now, once it gets in the brain, it has a lot of effects. Many of those you're all familiar with, but we understand these effects pretty well now because we understand the receptors that THC binds to and where they're located in the brain. So all of this makes a lot of sense. Obviously, the number one reason that people take marijuana is for its psychoactivity. Sedation is also associated with that. Cannabinoids have a lot of motor effects, and in particular, they really affect motor coordination, motor skills. Very easy to detect in human laboratory situations when you monitor motor coordination. Decreased memory retention is an extremely common phenomenon of the effect of THC, and it's very well modeled in a variety of animal models. Increased appetite. Back in the 60s, people used to laugh about the munchies. People got hungry when they took marijuana. That's not a joke. It's actually quite true. It's an effect that's done in the hypothalamus of the brain with the CB1 receptors, and in fact, it's a clinically relevant effect, which I'll talk about later. Unlike opioids, there's no effect of THC on the brainstem respiratory center. This is really important. I'll talk more about this later. There is increased heart rate, which the mechanism is not well understood. And there's also a decreased intraocular pressure. So what that means is that cannabis or THC could be a potential treatment for glaucoma. And it's been talked about for that, although it seems like there are a lot better medications to treat glaucoma than this. So the thing that's interesting about cannabis is it's not just a drug, it's not just a plant product. In fact, we all contain endogenous cannabinoid systems in our brains, and it's a very important system. It does a lot of things. So there are receptors that are located in our brain, cannabinoid receptors that are situated to bind these cannabinoids, particularly delta-9 THC. And so there are two types of receptors. The one that's most important for our discussion is the CB1 receptor, which is widely distributed in brain. One of the most abundant neurochemical receptors that's present in brain. It's widely distributed. It is particularly high in motor systems, particularly the regions that mediate initiation of motor behavior, coordination of movement. Regions like the hypothalamus that control appetite, I talked about in a minute. The hippocampus is an area that mediates our memory. Cannabinoids are there to impact memory as well as cognition. It's important also, I talked about these brainstem autonomic areas. So let's take a look at, come on, I know you can make it. There we go. This is an image of a section of rat brain. It's actually an experiment that was done in my lab some years ago. This is showing you where the cannabinoid receptors are located. So the hotter the color, the higher the area, the higher the abundance of these receptors. And this tells us, not only where the receptors are, but because each section, each region of the brain is associated with a different effect, it really tells us exactly, what part of the brain is mediating different effects of the receptor. Of the drug. These hot areas, these red areas, these are motor areas. These are areas that control initiation, coordination, and maintenance of motor systems. And once again, this is very, very evident in human laboratory studies where you can clearly see smoked marijuana producing deficits in motor coordination. Of course, you probably can't see it very well, but down here in the middle is the hypothalamus. That's the area that mediates the appetite. There's hippocampus here. This is the memory area. So cannabinoids inhibit the formation of memories. And that's an extremely important part of their task in the brain. You have to understand that not only for the brain, it's not only important to maintain memories, to generate memories, but there's a limited storage capacity. The brain is like a hard drive, and you don't want that hard drive to fill up. So cannabinoid systems are basically our forgetting neurotransmitter. It's the transmitter that's involved in getting rid of some of these memories and opening up some of that hard drive space in our brain. And of course, out here in the cortex, we have all of these cognitive effects and the effects of the high that we associate with the use of marijuana. But out here in the back of the brain, the brainstem, you don't see much happening. Actually, you don't see anything happening at all. And that's really important. For example, with opioids, if you did the same image with opioids, you see a big hot spot right here in the brainstem, in the area of the brain that mediates respiratory function. Opioids act in this area to shut off respiration. And that's the main reason why over 75,000 people died of opioid overdose in the US last year. So we all know that opioids are extremely dangerous, and that's the reason why. On the other hand, cannabinoids don't work there at all. So they don't produce respiratory depression. They don't really have any kind of lethality associated with them. So they're relatively safe. I had a colleague at the National Institute of Drug Abuse for years, and he used to make the joke that saying the only person who ever died of an overdose of marijuana had a bale of it fall on his head. So, you know, that's a joke, but it really gets back to the neuroscience of this. Okay, there's a good reason why marijuana doesn't produce overdose lethality, and that's because of that lack of brainstem activity. There's a lot of very important pharmacology that's going on in the cannabinoid systems. There are agonists that are being made. They're not really clinically relevant. There are antagonists as well, drugs that block the cannabinoid systems. And these are drugs that drug companies are examining for a potential, for example, as memory agents in Alzheimer's, or potentially for weight loss medications. These drugs are a long way from the market, and they do have some significant problems. So I don't know when they will become clinically relevant, but there is a lot of activity on this. The other type of cannabinoid receptors we don't really talk about today, unless you have questions about them. They really don't exist in brain. They're expressed in immune cells where they do affect immune function in a very complicated way. Immune cells are very heterogeneous, and they respond in very complicated ways to cannabinoids. But the other thing that's really very interesting about the cannabinoid system is not only do we have these receptors in brain, but our brains have their own endogenous cannabinoids, okay? And these are fatty acids, once again, lipophilic compounds that are not water soluble. They are synthesized in neurons in the brains. They're released like neurotransmitters in somewhat complicated ways, but nonetheless, anandamide and acylglycerol are two of these endogenous cannabinoids who provide a lot of very important functions for normal brain functions. They regulate memory, which I've talked about already. They regulate cognition, appetite, thermal regulation, body temperature. A number of effects are regulated by these important cannabinoid systems. So when we talk about cannabinoids, we're not just talking about the drugs that you find in the cannabis sativa plant, but also compounds, neurotransmitters, that we have in our own brains. Most people that take cannabis don't just take it once, okay? They take it chronically. They take it over a period of time, whether you're a recreational drug user, whether you are a person who habitually takes cannabis, to get high with a cannabis use disorder, or if you're a patient taking cannabis for medical marijuana purposes, you would be taking cannabis for a long period of time. There's a lot of misinformation out there about chronic cannabis use, and we know a lot more about it today than we did back in the 60s and 70s. So when we think about chronic drug use, in this case chronic cannabis use, there are three issues that are independent but equally important. Tolerance, which of course occurs when you have to take more and more of the drug to produce the same effect. A physical withdrawal, which is a series of physical symptoms which could occur after you withdraw away from the drug, you don't take it anymore. And addiction, which is basically defined as drug-seeking behavior, a process in which the desire for the drug really takes over someone's life and produces an addictive response. Traditionally, and I'm sure if you go on the internet today, you'll see people saying that none of this happens with cannabis use because cannabis is so safe and it doesn't produce these effects. In fact, they do. They produce all three of them. in various different ways. Tolerance in humans is not particularly common during intermittent use. So if people are intermittently using marijuana as a recreational user, they might use it a couple of times a week or maybe once or twice a month or something like that. Tolerance doesn't really develop for users like that. But when you really use cannabis on a daily basis, routinely, chronically, then you begin to see tolerance. And certainly you see that, and I'll talk much more about medical marijuana a little bit later on. But when we were on the Institute of Medicine Medical Marijuana Board examining this issue, we interviewed patients that were smoking up to 20 marijuana joints a day to maintain their therapeutic use. So clearly, under those circumstances, that there is a tolerance. Once again, withdrawal, a physical withdrawal that occurs after you go off the drug, that would never occur with a recreational drug user. Once again, the type of user that would be smoking the drug once a week or a couple of times a month, withdrawal is never going to be seen under those situations. And even in someone up here using chronic marijuana, you don't see withdrawal very much. It's certainly not very evident, but it can be generated in animal models. So withdrawal does occur, and it's very evident when you do it in a particular way in an animal model. So why isn't it very common in humans? Well, the answer is that it's the chemistry of THC itself, which is a major factor in preventing that. Because what happens is, as I talked about before, THC is so lipophilic. Okay, so when it's administered, whatever route you use, it immediately sequesters itself in these fatty tissues all over the body, and then it's slowly released over time. So someone who's been smoking marijuana and stops really hasn't stopped, because the THC is going to be slowly released from all of these fatty tissue over a period of days. And therefore that really prevents the acute withdrawal symptoms that we see in animal models. To create withdrawal in animal models, we have to produce an immediate withdrawal by using a cannabinoid antagonist. So that's a different story. Finally, addiction, and in the drug abuse research business, we call that reinforcement. I think it's certainly true that Delta-9 THC is a poor reinforcing agent. Once again, if you look at the internet, you'll see statements that say that THC has no addictive liability, that it doesn't produce any reinforcement, that there's no such thing as a cannabis addict. That is not true. It is true that it compared to much more potent drugs of abuse like heroin and cocaine, particularly cocaine. Cocaine is the most reinforcing agent that we know of. THC doesn't produce much reinforcement, but it does produce some reinforcement. There are cannabis CB1 receptors in brain reward systems. So when you smoke marijuana and you get that high, you are producing a small but significant reward effect. In other words, that is an effect that feels good. Most people who experience that with marijuana do not go on to have what we would call a DSM level dependence phenomenon, but some do. And studies indicate that approximately 20% of chronic cannabis users, in other words, these are users, once again, who use it a lot, almost every day, do qualify as dependent on cannabis. And there are treatment facilities that deal with that. So to say that it has no addictive liability is not true, but it's also not true that it has a high addictive liability. It's relatively low. So I'm going to segue into medical marijuana, which is an extremely important area, particularly relevant for the theme that you guys are talking about. It's been studied for many years. Some years ago, the U.S. Congress assigned the National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine to produce a comprehensive report on the science of medical marijuana. And I was fortunate enough to be chosen as one of the co-authors of that study. This was an amazing event. It took a couple of years to produce this report. We went to several different places around the country. We interviewed literally over 100 physicians and patients who used or prescribed medical marijuana. We read a lot of literature. We listened to a lot of anecdotal reports. Some of those anecdotes were, to be honest, worthless, but many of them were compelling, from patients who took medical marijuana, to treat syndromes that weren't well treated by other drugs. And we were very impressed by many of those, not all. We weren't impressed by all of them, but we were impressed by some of the compelling nature of some of these reports. So out of the vast number, and there are dozens of different indications that have been used by patients for medical marijuana, we whittled them down to 4 different areas for which there is good scientific and published evidence in well-controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled studies for medical marijuana, and I'll describe those. Antiemetic, okay, so this is used to the treatment of nausea and vomiting. And by the way, when I'm talking about medical marijuana, I am not talking about CBD, okay? I'm talking about marijuana as a plant, or THC as a pure drug. We'll talk about CBD specifically in just a few minutes. All right, so marijuana used very effectively in the treatment of nausea and vomiting, particularly for cancer patients who, as you know, experience a lot of nausea and vomiting in the treatment of their tumors with anti-cancer drugs. And many people, for many people, the traditional anti-nausea drugs for chemotherapy are not very effective, or they have side effects that are not very good for them. And so for them, medical marijuana has become an important adjunct. Analgesia, there's a lot of studies done on the effects of cannabinoids on pain, a variety of different pains, neuropathic pain, for example, which is a type of pain which is not well treated with opioids, inflammatory pain. But there's also a big placebo effect here too. And I'll describe more about this when I get into the CBD. Glaucoma, there is no question that THC, as I mentioned before, reduces intraocular pressure, could potentially be used as a glaucoma treatment. Probably not very relevant, because there are already other drugs that that treat glaucoma that don't have the side effects of THC. Increasing appetite, which once again is kind of a joke for people, the munchies, it turns out to be very important clinically. There are people who have a wasting disease, particularly muscle wasting disease. It's a phenomenon known as cachexia. And this is particularly common with people in the advanced stages of AIDS. These are people who don't have an appetite. They don't eat very much. The food that they do eat is not well absorbed. So they have a muscle wasting disease. Medical marijuana stimulates these people's appetites, allows them to eat better, allows them to absorb food better, and treats that phenomenon. So those are the 4 general areas that are that are well recognized. But of course, we saw many other things that were being done. Just about anything you can imagine has been tried for treatment. You see people talking about using medical marijuana as an antiviral. You hear it as for heart disease. You hear it for cancer. None of those indications have been proven for. Probably the most, the thing that's most interesting to many of us is the potential for using medical marijuana to treat certain motor diseases. Particularly has been tried in cases of muscular dystrophy or multiple sclerosis. The scientific evidence is not overwhelming at this stage, but perhaps shows some promise for that. The one thing that I think our committee did say, did conclude at the very end, was the concept of compassionate use. And that really comes from, you know, the first step of the Hippocratic Oath. As you may know, it says, above all, do no harm. You know, our committee came to the conclusion that medical marijuana rarely does any harm. It's relatively safe, very difficult, if not impossible, to overdose on marijuana. It does have side effects. And in fact, the high that you get from marijuana that many people want when they're recreationally using it, that is regarded as a negative side effect for people who are taking medical marijuana, okay? The people who want medical marijuana to treat their nausea and vomiting for chemotherapy or neuropathic pain or whatever, they're not looking to get high. They're really looking to eliminate their symptoms. So they titrate the dose of medical marijuana they use to really minimize that high. And so we, you know, in medical marijuana, we consider that the cognitive and sedative effects of marijuana as a negative side effect, not as something that is positive in terms of reducing the effects. The other issue that we dealt with a lot was whether or not medical marijuana should be used as the traditional way of smoking it as marijuana, or whether we should use purified Delta-9 THC itself. So you may not know that Delta-9 THC, which by itself is a Schedule I DEA drug, can actually be prescribed as this drug here, Marinol. It's not prescribed as marijuana. It's a pure medical substance like any other drug. And it's used primarily orally. It's actually also even used as a suppository. It's used, sometimes used in an inhaler. So Marinol is approved for therapeutic use. It can be prescribed, but many medical marijuana patients really came to the conclusion that they preferred to smoke marijuana because the smoking of the cannabis produces a much more rapid and easily titrated effect compared to the oral Marinol. Marinol is much slower to be absorbed and much slower to provide an effect. But from a medical perspective and a pharmaceutical perspective, you know, smoking is not a highly recommended route of administration. You know, you're smoking, okay? So you're introducing foreign substances into your lung. You know, the dose of THC in a marijuana plant can vary tremendously. There could be herbicides and insecticides present. So from a purely medical perspective, pharmaceutical perspective, and oral Marinol is probably a better approach, but most patients who are using medical marijuana, you know, prefer the smoked route, and that is the way it is. So medical marijuana, positives and negatives. Once again, I've already talked about the positives. There's clear scientific evidence that medical marijuana is effective in a variety of things, and from the phenomenon or the principle of compassionate use, we recommend that any physician should not feel paranoid about prescribing medical marijuana. So that's, you know, that is a recommendation of the Institute of Medicine. But of course, there is no such thing as a perfect drug. And you have to understand that there are potential problems. One of the things we looked at very conclusively is the abuse potential. We do know that there is potential, you know, for abuse of marijuana, but it's not anywhere near the potential of cocaine and opioids. We discussed the issue of whether marijuana is a gateway drug. For many years, you know, people considered smoking marijuana as a gateway to higher drugs. There is no epidemiological evidence that that is the case. Certainly people go on from marijuana to other drugs, but the same can be said for alcohol. And if you want to talk about a gateway drug, the most important gateway drug of all is nicotine, by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, we're not saying that people don't move on from marijuana to worse drugs, but there are a lot of other drugs that do the same thing, if not a lot worse. Talked about this already. If people are smoking, let's say 20 marijuana cigarettes a day, God help them, the potential for long-term lung damage is there. And so if that's the case, we'd like to see alternative delivery devices. Oral THC, as I mentioned already, is okay, but it's slow and variable. People have really looked a lot at THC inhalers, like you would use for asthma. It sounds like a really good idea, and it is a good idea, but technically very difficult to do because of the chemical nature of these drugs and the fact that they have to be dissolved in fatty oils and organic solvents. You don't really want to be spritzing an inhaler of some kind of oil or alcohol into your lungs. And I've talked about this already. Do you recommend smoking the cannabis plant versus using the pure Delta-9 THC or Marinol? And that is an ongoing debate. So let's talk about CBD. I know it's a highly profitable business these days. You can't open your email inbox without seeing all kinds of offers inducing you to buy all kinds of cannabidiol preparations, all kinds of stuff on the internet. CBD is potentially used for just about anything. I can't imagine that there's anything that CBD hasn't been touted for. Generally, when you see something like that, you should be suspicious, but nonetheless, it's out there. Let's talk about the good part first. As I mentioned earlier, CBD has no psychoactive effects. It does not bind to CB1 receptors. It does not produce any reinforcement. It does not produce any of the effects of THC because it's not a cannabinoid agonist. If there are any psychoactive effects in a preparation of CBD, it is most likely due to a contamination of the CBD by Delta-9 THC. Even the plants that are used to make commercial CBD do have a very small amount of THC in them. And so the manufacturing process of that is supposed to remove 99% of whatever THC is present in the plant. And so some of your more reputable CBD manufacturers and growers are very careful about doing that because CBD by itself is legal in many states. But Delta-9 THC is more complicated. But on the other hand, you might have some fly-by-night operators and growers who take a regular marijuana plant, or they're not very careful about separating the Delta-9 THC. So in those situations, you could potentially have a CBD preparation that could produce a high, but CBD by itself, no. So it has a very high safety index, virtually no addictive liability. So as a drug, it is very safe. No, unless there's some contaminants in it, not only THC, but as I said before, herbicides or insecticides or whatever, it has a high safety index. CBD, of course, is sold as a nutritional supplement. That means it's not formally approved by the FDA. Most nutritional supplements do have to follow some purity requirements, and some of the CBD preparations that I've seen out there are in pretty good shape in terms of purity. So the purity aspects may be pretty good, particularly if people buy more reputable sources of CBD. You have to, but to be honest, many of the claims of therapeutic efficacy are highly exaggerated. Once again, you see CBD claimed for just about anything you can imagine: antiviral therapies, cancer, respiratory problems. I see CBD marketed as a veterinary medicine. So you have CBD doggy treats, where you feed your dog CBD treats, and it treats whatever they've got. Could be veterinary arthritis or many other things. The claim that really is without any scientific background are the cognitive claims. You see claims that CBD increases memory, reduces Alzheimer's effects, stuff like this. There is no scientific basis for any of those cognitive effects. So what kinds of studies do exist to show that CBD does have effects? Well, there are some out there. But we're still, unfortunately, in early days. I'm going to start out with this one, even though it doesn't affect, I would say, any of us that are on this Zoom call. The treatment of childhood epilepsy disorders, typified by Dravet syndrome. If you're not familiar with this, it's really an incredible story. These childhood epilepsy victims can have hundreds of seizures a day, and they are, obviously uncomfortable. But all of those seizures produce very dramatic, intellectual, long-term effects, in these pediatric patients, and although some of these pediatric patients respond to traditional anti-epileptic drugs, many of them do not. So there's a famous story, Charlotte's Web. You can look it up on the internet if you haven't heard about it, where the parents of this pediatric patient started giving her very large doses of CBD, which dramatically reduced her epilepsy seizures, and it was an enormous thing. So much so that there's a company out in Colorado that produces CBD at high quantities, large doses, specifically for these patients. We have no idea how this works. To be honest, CBD doesn't bind to CB1 cannabinoid receptors, so this is not a cannabinoid effect. CBD does bind to other types of receptors at high concentrations, high doses, vanilloid receptors, which we don't know much about. So there's lots of speculations, but no real understanding about the mechanisms. But obviously, parents of kids who suffer from these disorders don't really care about mechanisms, right? So I think that is really a very important use for CBD and highly recognized. There have also been relatively good studies to show that CBD, once again at high doses, can reduce anxiety in some patients as well as insomnia. But these are disorders that respond to a variety of other things. It's difficult to really know. But anyway, there are at least studies that support that use, and there's probably more interest in CBD as an analgesic. In particular, there are studies out there in animal models that show that CBD reduce inflammatory pain. So you see a lot of CBD use in arthritis. And I think there's particularly interest in the pharmaceutical industry for combining CBD with other analgesics, so that you get sort of a synergistic effect. CBD by itself may not do very much, but if you combine it with a low-risk opioid analgesic, for example, buprenorphine is one that's been talked about, then you may get a synergistic effect between these two drugs that could produce some real interesting analgesia. So these are sort of the issues that we have with CBD. Once again, I will repeat the compassionate use phenomenon. Because of the high safety index of CBD, it doesn't hurt to take it. and you know, there's high levels of variability among people who do take it, but you know, there's certainly no harm in doing it. I can tell you my own personal experience. I've had 6 or 7 people come up to me knowing my, you know, knowledge in this area and asking whether they should take CBD, most of them for arthritis and arthritis related stuff. I don't know why they asked me. I'm not an MD, okay, so I can't give medical advice. I don't give medical advice. But from, you know, from a basic science point of view, I tell them, look, you're not going to do yourself any harm here. The drug is safe. It's expensive. The profit margin on CBD is enormous. But try it. If you want to try it for a few weeks, there is no harm in doing it. I don't tell them that in pain scenarios, it's well established that about 30% of pain patients respond to placebos. And actually, in neuroscience, we understand the mechanism of this placebo effect. So if someone thinks that something's going to work, very often it does. But I don't tell them that. I can tell you that everyone I know that's taken CBD, particularly for arthritis, has seen zero effect. But it, like I said, it doesn't hurt to try it. It is safe. All right. So I'm going to end my talk today with another topic in the cannabinoid area, and this is synthetic or designer cannabinoids. These are a perniciously nasty bit of business that used to be sold in convenience stores, gas stations, head shops, hookah shops, all over, and sold legally. These are marketed under a variety of names. Spice is probably the most common name. K2, there are 100 different varieties of these things. They started out in Europe in 2004, but really became a profitable product from Asian laboratories in the early 2000s. And what this is that they these guys went to the literature. So obviously the research into cannabinoids is a very active area, and chemists have synthesized thousands of cannabinoid derivatives. These are synthetic derivatives that were designed to be studied in the laboratory, not in humans, never in humans, but designed to be studied either in the test tube or in animal models. Some of these synthetic cannabinoids are literally hundreds of times more potent than THC, and not particularly difficult for a skilled chemist to make. So these illicit laboratories, particularly in Asia, were synthesizing these things and spraying them on some kind of plant that people could smoke. You know, it could be just about anything, a real weed, rosemary, whatever, and then marketing them. And because there was no law against it, because these compounds were never meant to be sold, never meant to be developed for human beings, that meant that anybody could sell them. So it became a problem. Fortunately, the problem became lessened in 2012 when the Synthetic Drug Abuse Prevention Act classified most of these compounds as Schedule I, and therefore they became illegal. So you don't see as much of these compounds around anymore. They are around, not as much of them, partly because of this law. The other reason is not so positive, is that is because many of the illicit laboratories that originally made these designer cannabinoids got out of that business and started making fentanyl and fentanyl analogs, and they're sending that to the U.S. and of course fentanyl is deadly, and fentanyl overdose is now the major cause of fatalities in the opioid epidemic that we're experiencing now. So as bad as these designer cannabinoids are, they're not as bad as fentanyl. Anyway, people took these compounds, once again, these are compounds that are hundreds of times more potent than THC. They last a long time. they produce psychoactive effects for days for some people. Okay, so we saw emergency room visits for panic reactions for people who just couldn't stop having psychoactive, effects, and all kinds of psychotic symptoms, and there's just all kinds of problems with these products. There's no way of knowing how pure they are. They could have contaminants from the chemical synthesis, all kinds of herbicides, insecticides. You have no idea what the dosing is because they're totally impure. These compounds, as I mentioned just a minute ago, have never been tested in humans. They were never designed to be tested in humans. We have no clue in any systemic way what their acute or chronic effects are. Their subjective effects may be very different from THC because they are so potent. And as I mentioned before, their duration of action is much longer than that of THC. One of the nice things about smoked THC is that you get your high, and then after a few hours, it's gone. So these guys with the spice users are seeing many hours, if not days, of effects. So I'll end it with my story. Just a few years ago, I was interviewed by a local TV station about the spice issue. And so they interviewed me in my lab, and I had my white lab coat on, very official, and I talked about these very specific issues. And I ended up by saying basically anyone that takes these things are basically idiots, and that I'm not recommending that people go out and get high on marijuana, but if you want to really get high on marijuana, you're much better off smoking the cannabis plant. Obviously, we have 1,000 years of history with. We know exactly what it does, as opposed to these crazy things, which we know nothing about. Well, of course, they put this on the TV, and that's the quote they put up there. And the next morning, I got a call from somebody in the dean's office. They weren't happy. They said, Dr. Childers, you're not supposed to be recommending smoking marijuana. That's really bad news for our medical center. You're in trouble, this, and that, and the other. So they issued a press release. I think this is the only time my name was ever connected to a press release. And it said, neither Wake Forest School of Medicine or North Carolina Baptist Hospital nor Professor Childers wants people to go out and smoke marijuana. We don't recommend that. We just caution you about taking these other things. And so that was my story. But I did eventually get revenge for that, because I included that story in my medical lectures on cannabis, and medical students just love that story because they love to hear stuff like that about their school. And it turned out that my lectures on cannabis always ended up being my most popular lecture. So even though I'm not allowed to say that, okay, and you didn't hear it from me, I still believe that what I said was true. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm going to go ahead and stop this sharing, and I will open this up for any any discussions that you have. I may be a little bit over time here. Sorry about that.
No problem. Thank you very much. It was really an excellent lecture. Even I can follow it at my advanced stage, no problem. And you convinced me about lots of things. So we'll open it to questions from people here in the Oak Room or who are following this online. Anybody in the Oak Room?
Okay, Professor Childers, you may see in the chat, one question says, any comment about using the vaporizer, THC vapor?
Yeah, so I talked about that a little bit, and the vaporizer is a solution to some of the problems that I talked about, and that is that it eliminates the smoked form of marijuana. So I would think that most physicians would recommend that someone would take a vaporize, an inhaler form of medical marijuana as opposed to smoking it, just to avoid some of those issues. The problem is these inhalers are complicated to make. and they use complicated mixtures of formulations in order to get them directly into the lung. So they haven't been validated as much as I would like to see them done. But if someone is using medical marijuana chronically, to treat a syndrome, I would probably prefer to go in that direction.
How about LSD Tobos brownies?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
How about LSD Tobos brownies?
Oh, bro! You're showing your age. These are called edibles. Okay, so it doesn't matter how you consume cannabis or THC orally, whether it's pure form or whether you drink it in a tea or whether you put it in brownies or chocolate chip cookies or gummies. Edible gummies have become a major thing out in Colorado. You buy them, in all these places. So the oral THC is not well absorbed because of its lipophilicity. There's a lot of variability in it. It's slow to absorb, so it's slow to get the effects. And there's a lot of variability in terms of individual, effects. But clearly, edibles are very popular, very very safe. But in our Institute of Medicine review, most people who are experiencing real serious issues for which they took their medical marijuana really preferred to smoke it. Once again, medical professionals would much rather see another type of route of administration other than smoking.
Paula Crowley, I don't want to butcher all of your questions and comments here. If you'd like to unmute.
Is that a question?
Hi, go ahead. I'm here. Yeah, I had sent it in by chat, so I'll just read it. Okay, so right. I was curious about if CBD receptors that are highly expressed in immune cells naturally or in response to intake of THC, and if it's the latter, does chronic THC use impair or aid immune function?
That's a really good question, and it's very complicated. So the CB2 receptors in immune cells are there already. They are part of normal immune cell function. What we do see clear chronic cannabinoid effects on immune function, but it is complicated by the fact that the immune system is composed of many different types of cells, and cannabinoids have different effects on different types of cells. So cannabinoids inhibit the function of some immune cells, and they stimulate the function of other immune cells. So the overall effect of chronic cannabinoids on immune function really depends upon the individual and the type of immune function that we're looking at. For example, with AIDS patients, that is a problem. And once again, THC is used in AIDS patients for that phenomenon. I talked about cachexia. But for those individuals, it's very important to monitor whatever immune function is remaining.
Okay, thank you. I did have another question if I can get that in, but otherwise I can wait.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So you had listed also, and this was news to me, I didn't realize we had endogenous cannabinoids. So I was curious if our endogenous cannabinoids are blocked in some way by introduction of exogenously introduced cannabinoids, and therefore are they potentially harmful for nerve function, since it was looking like you were saying that research might be indicating use of the cannabinoids for motor diseases.
Yeah. That's another really good question, and I'll just short circuit it by saying we don't really know. There's no there's no evidence that chronic cannabinoids reduce endogenous cannabinoid release. Clearly, though, in long term, like I talked about before, if you're a habitual daily user of cannabis, you do produce tolerance, and that is produced in our laboratory, actually showed this, a desensitization of CB1 receptors in particular regions of the brain. So this is a problem, and it is a relevant issue for people who are taking it every day. If people are, as I said before, if people are intermittently taking it once a week, twice a week, something like that, but as long as there's a timeout period between the administrations, we don't see that level of desensitization. Now, I do see I did bring up the chat. So let me ask, let's see, I think I talked about the vaporizer. Immune cells, okay, that's the next one. What is the best form to take CBD in? Any more form you want. Obviously, it's highly it's used a lot in edibles. That is probably its most popular function, but it's sold in just about any way you can imagine. So people use it. I would say most commonly in edibles. Okay, I answered the question about endogenous cannabinoids being blocked. Is there a list of reputable CBD providers? And what other analgesics combined effectively with CBD? All right, so those are two questions. I can't give you a list of so-called reputable CBD providers. I can give a disclaimer. I was a consultant briefly with the Charlotte's Web providers out in Colorado. I was very impressed with their facilities in terms of production, manufacturing, purity standards. I did not continue that relationship because I just could not agree with the marketing strategies, the claims that were being used, particularly in terms of cognitive effects. People were taking it as a memory enhancer. I don't see any scientific evidence for that. Once again, we remember the process of compassionate use. It will not do any harm, but I don't know of the evidence for that. In terms of other analgesics, this is a new area, and it's in terms of actual pharmaceutical products, it's too early to say. I do know of a company that's just beginning to test the combination of buprenorphine, which is the active ingredient in Suboxone. It's a low efficacy opioid analgesic, along with CBD, but it's probably 5 years away from the market.
Professor Childers, we have a hand up. Rick Gold, if you'll go ahead.
Thanks so much. The number of medical marijuana centers that have opened up is just amazing to me, and it makes me wonder, where do all the patients come from, and are they all legitimate? The other side to it is that it should open up a lot of opportunities for research, and so I was wondering what you've seen in terms of research of these centers or potential future research.
Well, first of all, there is a lot of research being done in medical marijuana. These are difficult clinical trials to do. As you may know, a clinical trial needs to be double-blind, placebo-controlled. Doing a placebo with an active form of marijuana is challenging. But nonetheless, there is research. There are publications being done, and absolutely, we need more information. And one of the points that I wanted to bring out, and I forgot, was when we talk about medical marijuana, we know it's safe. Okay, what we don't know is efficacy. And there's so much variability, and so much of the evidence that's out there is anecdotal, uncontrolled, sorts of things. And so we really need more science involved in that. And that's we've been asking that for a long time. But yes, I'm not surprised that more facilities are opening up for medical marijuana. Obviously, more and more states are legalizing marijuana for medical purposes, and once again, it's a safe alternative. The question that I always want to know is, medical marijuana is safe, but it clearly has side effects. The most important one being the high, the sedative effects, which, as I said earlier, most patients don't want to have. The question that a clinician needs to ask if he's considering, prescribing medical marijuana, is medical marijuana going to be better than what we already have out there? And very few people really ask that question. And that's the critical question that we got to have for medical marijuana. Is it better? Is it more efficacious than what's already out there before? If it is, it needs to be used more often.
And then the last two I see in chat are about operating a motor vehicle with medical marijuana or CBD, and then vaporizing the whole flower.
Yes, okay. I've had arguments with people about motor vehicle stuff. Recently, I had an acquaintance who, was an intermittent user of marijuana. He says, "I've never had any trouble getting in a car. I feel in complete control." I said, "Well, that's part of the problem, isn't it?" All I can tell you is laboratory testing. Some of that was done right here at Wake Forest University, so it's research that I know a lot about already. As I showed you the map of the brain where cannabinoid receptors are very high in motor areas, particularly motor coordination areas, and the laboratory testing in human laboratory settings clearly shows significant deficit of motor coordination at doses that do not yet produce a significant high. The motor systems in the brain are very sensitive to THC, but if you're getting high, you don't understand that. Okay, you're going along just fine. No worries. I would question people who, and these things are, once again, you can find anything on the internet you want. I would question people who claim that there are no motor coordination effects of marijuana. I would suggest they haven't done the control experiment that needs to be done. In terms of vaporizing the whole flower, I'm not sure I can answer that. Most of the inhalation things, all the inhalation things I've seen have been using the pure product, but there's no reason why you couldn't do that. I think what you'd want to do, though, you'd have to extract the active ingredient through some kind of organic solvent and then put that into the inhaler. So so inhalers not only, I should step back. Inhalers not only do the pure compound, but you can also have cannabis oils in these inhalers as well. And I think that's probably would be more popular than the other alternative.
Steve, I have a question about purity. What is the quality control? If you're going to smoke it, how do you know, considering all the variables you told us about it, what is exactly that you're smoking?
Well, so there's two issues here. Number one is smoked marijuana. And of course, you have no clue. When you're smoking marijuana, you have no clue about the dose. You have no clue about the contaminants that might be present, nothing. Now, that issue may be reduced somewhat as places, as legalization becomes more popular or more common. And let's face it, regardless of how you feel about marijuana legalization, it's a done deal. Okay, it is being recreational marijuana is being legalized in many states. Of course, it's still illegal by the federal government. But it's increasingly common in states around the country, and I predict that in some years it will be ubiquitous. So now that marijuana is being sold in shops legally by companies whose trade names become recognized and trademarks are filed and legalized, I would hope that these problems with purity, dosage become more standard. And I think they probably will, because it becomes a marketing point, okay? And there's a humongous amount of money in legal marijuana sales. In the CBD market, once again, the problem here is that it's a nutritional supplement, and therefore the standards that the FDA employ for regular drugs are not employed in the same way for these. It's a crapshoot in terms of that. Once again, the one place that I have seen and actually inspected, I was very impressed with their quality control, but I can make no claims about any of the others.
I see your former chairman is online. I wondered if he had any comments he would like to make at this point. Alan?
Could you repeat the question so we can hear?
He's asking Al Nimes whether he has any comments, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
We can hear
Okay.
you and we can see you, Al.
Yeah, well, it's great to see you, Steve.
Absolutely. Same here. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, the comment was I learned a lot. It's a very rapidly developing field, isn't it?
No doubt about that. Controversial, and it'll remain that way. But that's why I always have a disclaimer at the beginning.
Gotcha. Well, it's good to see you.
Absolutely. Great.
So with that, I'd like to thank Professor Childers very much for his successful return engagement to the University of Florida arena. And thanks again. And
Thanks a lot, and everybody stay cool and safe, please.
You want to talk about next week?
You know what? I don't have my program in front of me, so.
Well, I think
I'll function.
we have a session on Indian and Chinese medicine with an emphasis on acupuncture next week. So tune in. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone. Stay well.